Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. I hope everyone is doing good, inshallah. I'll just wait for 30 to 45 seconds for everyone to join, inshallah, and then we'll be making a start, inshallah. So, today, inshallah, we are going to be discussing the historical context of the differences and how the differences actually came about, number one. And number two, also, we'll be discussing about this famous hadith of the 73 sects, which obviously a lot of, let's say, people have spoken about it, and a lot of things are actually attributed to this. So, inshallah, we'll try to understand it from a perspective which hopefully will be something, inshallah, which will make a lot of sense for us, and how the author actually describes this particular concept for us. So inshallah, let's make a start in Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh wa na'udzu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. May yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa may yudlil fala hadiya lahu. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So alhamdulillah, today is episode number 5 of this great book, Tilbees, Iblees of Ibn al-Jawzi. We have discussed quite a fair bit of detail with regards to innovation, the concept of bid'ah, how actually do we understand bid'ah. We then also went to a bit of detail into exactly how do we understand this word sunnah, what is described as sunnah. So we'll continue to evaluate these particular concepts, and inshallah today, hopefully in the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes, we'll discuss in quite some depth the historical context, the historical, let's say, legacy of how actually the difference of opinion came about. Yeah, a lot of actually this information which I'm going to be sharing today is from various sources. Again, both kind of English sources and other language sources, inshallah. And hopefully it will make a lot of sense, inshallah, as we move along. And I will continue to give references wherever I can, inshallah, for the various pieces of information which I'm getting from, inshallah. Okay. So basically, we started chapter number 1 last week, and if we continue on the theme of chapter number 1, then the author Ibn al-Jawzi, he actually states this adherence, that what exactly is this adherence to the Jama'ah, and what is this concept of Sunnah. And he brings actually one particular hadith where Umar radhiyallahu anhu has reported that on one occasion Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stood amongst the Sahaba, and then he said, "Whosoever amongst you desire the center of paradise should keep close to the Jama'ah," yani the community of the Muslims, close to the Jama'ah. For the devil, the shaitan, closely accompanies the solitary individual and is more distant from two. Okay. And inshallah, remember this particular hadith, because this concept of Jama'ah, the community of the Muslims, this is a concept which is going to now play a very important role in our discussion as to how do we understand exactly what is the meaning of all of this, how do we understand this, etc. Guys, can I also please request one of the team members to switch off the captions, because I think the captions are again there. So you can please switch off the captions. I won't be able to check the feeds because I'm speaking, so I won't be able to check the technical details as to what's happening. Okay, then also remember that author also brings another particular hadith by Abu Darda, where Prophet ﷺ actually has said that people were sitting in a gathering, and Prophet ﷺ said, the companions were sitting with the Prophet, that they were actually discussing destitution, yani poverty. Yani that is something which obviously, as we know from the days of Makkah and after the Hijrah, that was something which is a pretty serious concept, amongst the, obviously, Sahaba, they were quite, obviously, a lot of them were quite poor. And Prophet ﷺ then asked them that, do you fear destitution? And then Prophet ﷺ said, by Allah in whose hands is my life, the riches of this world will be poured upon you abundantly, till nothing but this world will cause the heart of any one of you to deviate from the truth. By Allah, I am leaving you, yani after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I am leaving you with something like brightness night is as it's like it's day. And this was reported by Abu Darda. And then he said, by Allah, Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam left us on a path which was absolutely full of light, full of brightness. Now, this is the hadith, this is the concept, this is the sunnah. Now, what exactly happened? How does the differences come along? Yeah, a lot of people ask that, okay, fine. We go to one particular group, he says that I'm following Quran and Sunnah. You go to the other group, he also says I'm following the Quran and Sunnah. Then you go to a third party, they also say we are following the same. Yeah, correct? Isn't this the case? So if that is happening, then number one, how do we make sense of all this, of all these differences, number one? And what is the applicability of that hadith of 73 sects? That is also we'll try to explore. Whether that is something which is applicable to these particular differences, or is that something else? What have the scholars, how have the scholars explained that particular hadith? We'll inshallah see now. So then also remember that from the perspective of the Sunnah, we did a very comprehensive session last week with Sheikh Sohaib, going into a lot of depth as to exactly how do we understand hadith, how do we understand Sunnah, what are these different terms, is Sunnah enough, is Quran enough for us, how do we differentiate between, is Sunnah and hadith the same thing, etc., etc. And again, whosoever wants to again go into a lot of detail with regards to the understanding, please refer to the Sunday Night Raw show which we did last Sunday with Sheikh Sohaib. It's available on different feeds, and inshallah you'll be able to get a very good comprehensive understanding. Especially that particular session answers a lot of new terms, a lot of new concepts, let's say a lot of new terminologies which people have tried to change over time. So inshallah that particular show will help to let's say correct those particular concepts, inshallah. So this particular hadith which Miqdam has narrated, the Prophet ﷺ has said that very soon a tradition of mine will be related to a person lying on his couch who will then say, the book of Allah, that is the Quran, is enough between you and us. Whatever we find in it as halal, as lawful, we accept it. And whatever we find it in haram in it, which is unlawful, we take it as behold whatever Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam has declared as haram is just like that which Allah has declared as haram. Okay, so now keeping in mind the previous lessons on exactly what is bid'ah, what is innovation, and now we are trying to understand that what is the opposite of bid'ah? It is sunnah, as we have repeatedly been saying. It is sunnah. Then also remember that we need to be patiently restricting ourselves to the sunnah, and the important thing is that we are not supposed to be the people who are going to be going beyond. And we discussed in quite some depth again in the previous two episodes as to these minor differences, and we gave a lot of examples. How do we understand those differences? Okay, and also remember that the decisions of the rightly guided caliphs, which is whom? Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman, Ali, and the rest of the companions as a whole, when they are taking certain positions, then for us, as the Prophet ﷺ has said, that khairun nasi karni, summa allazina jalawnahum, summa allazina jalawnahum, that the best of the generation is my generation, and then the one which succeeds it, and then the one who succeeds it. That particularly means that for us, sunnah, the statements of the Sahaba and the statements of the Tabi'in and the Taba Tabi'in is something which is very, very important for us to give consideration to. And as I stated, that most of the people, most of the groups, most of the differing, which is there is because of what? Is people say, we are following the Salaf, we are following the differences of opinion which are kind of there, which have been there historically, yeah? So how do we make sense of it now? So now let us actually look at the historical context of exactly how this came about. But what I'll do is that I will start, inshallah, by narrating what the author narrates with regards to this particular hadith, which is going to be now coming. Keeping in mind also another thing, that differing in ummah is something which is inevitable and which was predicted by the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, this is not something which is recommended. Yeah, this is not something which is recommended, but Rasulullah ﷺ has predicted. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. This is very clear. This is the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is absolutely clear. There is no argument, there is no doubt about it. But again, differing is something which is what? Which is not a command but a prediction of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As the Prophet ﷺ has said in a hadith reported by Abu Dawud, that whosoever amongst you lives after I am gone, then he will see a great deal of descent. Okay, this is something which is a prediction of Prophet ﷺ. Now, what we have seen dissent in all types of differing. So we have seen differences in the political sphere. We have seen the differences in thought. We have seen the differences in Aqidah. Yeah, we have seen the differences in other minor kind of the furrow of the deen. Yeah, but again, this is something which was a prediction of Prophet ﷺ and which has actually obviously has come about. On top of it, the famous hadith of splitting the ummah, as they say, yeah, that what is the prediction? That Abu Huraira, and again, there are a lot of various turk of this particular hadith, and this is a kind of, you can say, this is a mutawatir hadith, which actually has been narrated by a number, more than 20 companions, and there are various kind of turk, and I will speak about 2 or 3 of them, inshallah, today. So the first is that Prophet ﷺ has said, which is narrated by Abu Huraira, and the status of this particular hadith is Hasan. And Prophet ﷺ has said that the Yahud, they have split into 71 or 72 sects, and the Christians likewise. But the people of my ummah are going to be divided into 73 sects. They are going to be divided. Tafarraqu, yeah. And then Prophet ﷺ also said, ummati, and he's mentioning clearly this word ummati, that the people of my ummah. So remember this, my ummah. Yeah, this is very important to understand. Then again, in various other ahadiths, also it has been mentioned towards the end, kulluhum fin nari illa millatin wahida, that only who is going to be correct, who everyone is going to be going into the fire, except what? Except one. Then also, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan narrated that Prophet ﷺ has said that those who came before you of the people of the book split into 72 sects, and this ummah will split into 73. 72 in the hellfire and 1 in paradise. And that is the Jama'ah. Remember that discussion of Jama'ah, the body of the Muslims. Okay, again, this is also a very important concept to understand, that when we say Jama'ah, it actually means the body of the Muslims. Guys, remember another thing. I'm just jumping the gun, but it's important that I jump the gun now so that we understand this correctly. That when Prophet ﷺ is saying 72 in the hellfire and only 1 who is rightly guided, are we actually saying that the 73 parts are all kind of the same unit? Yeah, and obviously the answer is no, because the Jama'ah is always going to be the one which is in majority. And as we have seen, and as the author continues to explain, that most of these splinter groups which broke away from the body of the Muslims, and remember when Prophet ﷺ is also mentioning that they are from my ummah, ummati, they are from my ummah, this actually means that even those 72 which broke away still would be considered Muslims. Okay, they still would be considered Muslims. They would be having innovations, yeah, but they are not kuffar, nauzubillah. This needs to be again clarified absolutely, yani, in absolute terms. This again, as I mentioned in the last week, various books, which we have been discussing of Shahrastani, Al-Minal wal-Nahl, again other books. Ibn Taymiyyah mentions that in Majmul Fatawa, and inshallah we'll be quoting, bringing the evidence from Ibn Taymiyyah as well. That number one, like I said, these parts, these separate parts are not alike. Okay, so some of them are very, very small. For example, the first sect which broke away from the body of the Muslims, which were the Khawarij, and they are in existence even today. Yani, I don't want to name the country where they are. I've lived in that country for a while, and basically they are still there. They are in existence, but again, a very, 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 very small population of the Muslims, very small. Similarly, the very earlier sects like Jahmiyyah, yeah, and again, yani, inshallah, I will not be discussing every sect as we go along, okay, because that is something which is historical. If anyone wants to kind of read exactly what were their thoughts, then you can read it in their own time, because I want to focus on what actually helps us as Muslim of the 20th century to understand what impacts us. How do we make it understand? And number one, the second objective, guys, is that basically we are not going to be the ones who are going to be creating further rifts and splitting the ummah even further. Okay, we are not going to be the ones. If we go back to the classical text, then we'll straight to the classical text. We'll go to the opinions of the scholars, and inshallah, from the opinion of the scholars, we'll see how they've understood historically that what is that which broke certain sects from the body of the Muslim, from the body of the Jama'ah. So like I said, they are not the same. Yani, for example, you take it, for example, if there are 5 billion Muslims right now, so inshallah, the body of the Muslims, the Jama'ah, is on the right, inshallah. This is how, inshallah, and I'll explain it to you, how do we make it understand. Okay? Now, Abu Dawud also narrated that, and again, Shatibi has brought in Al-Ihtisam, the greatest book of Shatibi, which we mentioned even last week. Also, Ibn Hajar has brought in his book, Al-Takhreed Al-Kashaf. Also, Ibn Taymiyyah mentions in Majmul Fatawa as well, that these are the various sources. Again, Milal wal Nahl, Al-Farq Bain al-Firq, all these books, when we read through and we understand how the scholars have understood, then the most important thing, again, I'll repeat again, is what? Is the consensus of the Muslim scholars is the main body of the Muslims. Okay? Now, when we say that the consensus of the scholars is the main body of the Muslims, what do we mean by that? Because someone might argue, no, now you are coming up with a new innovation. Yeah, someone might say, no, this is not right. This is not how we understood. This is not what the scholars have said. The Salafis would say, no, this is not the case. We are the safe sects, and the Deobandis will say, no, we are the safe sects, and the Barelvis will say, no, we are the safe sects, and the Sufis would say, no way. How dare you say that? We are the safe sect. And the Shias would say, no way. We are the safe sect. Yeah. So everyone would be arguing. So how do we now understand all of this? Yeah. Now, let's now look at the historical context as to how we as Muslims, how we have developed over time. So what is the prophetic era? The prophetic era is from roundabout, if you're talking in terms of the Christian era, then the prophetic era has been from 609 Christian era to 632 Christian era. In those, obviously in the prophetic era, to have a difference was almost impossible. Although, as we have seen, that there were certain, for example, differences in terms of understanding how the Sahaba understood, and we have given some examples in the previous episodes. You can go and listen to those episodes. But it was not basically possible to have any difference, because Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was there to kind of mend the ways of any kind of differences which was there. It was obvious. Yeah. There were basically three main categories, as the Quran has mentioned repeatedly in the various kind of surahs. You know, look into Surah Tawbah, you look into in Surah Baqarah, the initial verses of Surah kind of Baqarah, that you have three categories. You have the Muslim, you have the non-believer, the disbeliever, the kafir, and you have the munafiq. Okay, these were the three categories of people which are mentioned in the Quran, and also which were there when in the prophetic era. Now, what happened after that? So you can say that from the 1st century, and again, this information is from various sources. In the English-speaking community, there's a book of Bilal Phillips, obviously the evolution of fiqh. A lot of information is from there. There are other kind of scholars which have written books on it. Some of its information from there. Again, reading of the history of the Muslims. You go into the kind of the history book of the Ibn Kathir, which he has written. Again, you look into the various other books. Again, like I said, this information which I'm going to narrate it is not from one source, but I'm just going to summarize some notes which I've prepared from all these various sources. So the 1st century to the 3rd century, you can say that there were differences which were coming. Yeah, so you have Imam Abu Hanifa, you have Imam Malik in Medina, you have then Imam Shafi, yeah, who again is from he's traveled quite a fair bit, for all the way from Syria to Iraq, etc. And he in Arabia also, he was there for a long time. When he came for Hajj, his mother brought him for Hajj here. And then you also have Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, which is again there. And this particular period, 1st to 3rd century, there were kind of differences which were happening on a continuum, and basically fiqhi differences. Yeah, not any kind of major differences in the aqaid. Some of these differences started to happen in the aqaid as well. But you can say that the Sunni theology overall was that the leaders were politically kind of aligned from an Aqidah perspective mostly, and everyone was implementing Sharia to the best of their abilities. This is how it was. Obviously, the Shia, they broke off slightly. Sorry guys, okay, fine. I'm just saying that maybe there was some issue with how the feed was, but it's fine, alhamdulillah. Okay, now, so the Shia were actually a little bit, they had this concept of the Pope, which was coming through, yeah, the concept of Imamite, the 12th Imam, which, as per their belief, he disappeared, and we'll see that then how Khomeini understood this concept of the 12th Imam, yeah. There were certain theological differences, like what does it mean to be a Muslim, for example, and as we know that the first sect, as we mentioned, to break away from the body of the Muslims were the Kharijites, the Khawarij. So, and their belief was that if someone drank, or if someone, he told a lie, he cheated, so basically, khalas, he is no more a Muslim, and it was his blood was halal as per their theology. But again, like we said, that the mainstream Sunni Muslims were obviously considered these as sins, obviously, as we've understood from the concept of Iman, that these are sins. These are not, obviously, no one becomes Nauzubillah kafir when if he's drinking, for example, or if he's cheating or lying. These are obviously major sins, but you cannot say that they are becoming Nauzubillah, they're from the, not the body of the Muslims. Then, what other differences came? People like Qadariya, and Mu'tazilites as well, who actually had issues with the concept of Qadar. As in Sahih Muslim, the first hadith in Sahih Muslim, which Imam Muslim has brought, speaks about this Qadar, the hadith of Jibreel, which actually he brings in. Yeah, he brings that, and this was there. The rationalists, the Mu'tazilites, which were there in the first, between kind of the 1st and the 3rd century. And again, there were other differences as to how the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is being understood. Yeah, all these differences. A lot of this was coming actually from the Christian theology. So, this word issue, the Jesus being the word of Allah, the Kalimullah, yeah. So this difference which came into the Muslims came actually from the Christians, from the Nasara. that what is the speech? Is Quran created or is Quran uncreated? And obviously we know the Quran is obviously uncreated. It's the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the speech? What is the nature of the kalam within the Muslims? What is the nature of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Again, all of this is, a lot of it is coming from Christian theology, and some of it is coming from obviously the Greek and the Aristotelian, you can say, philosophies as well. So these differences were coming along. And the major imams, as I've mentioned, they were living in this time. Yeah. On top of that, you have the likes of the great Imam Layth bin Sa'd, Sufyan Thawri. These major scholars also were living amongst that time as well. On the other spectrum, now you had these Sufis who were towards the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. They were also coming in, the ascetic lifestyle, and they were developing their philosophy. Yeah, and this philosophy, which later on then Imam Ghazali and Al-Razi, they actually they were the major proponents of this philosophy. And again, all these tariqas, like the Junaidi tariqas and the other tariqas after the 6th to the 8th centuries, they actually then brought in their own philosophies within it, and again, they expanded on these Sufi tariqas. But the point is that there was no clear-cut demarcation. Yeah, most of the people understood the Quran how it was to be understood. Most of the people understood, the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the names of attributes. Like I said, a little bit of differences started to happen, but majority of the Muslims were, alhamdulillah, there were no real issues there. The 4th century, you can say the 3rd era, as most of the scholars have mentioned, this 3rd era, which is from the 4th century to the 6th century, this is where the codification of the mazahib that actually started. So you have this demarcation and crystallization of a lot of the content. So you had this Sufi, the Athari, the Hanbali, the Maliki creeds. On the other spectrum, you had the Mu'tazilite, you had the Ashari creed as well amongst it. And the sects, they started to gather, they started to form. So the genesis existed in the previous kind of era, but now it was being crystallized. Yeah, and kind of things started to become very clear cut. Now, between the 6th and the 7th century, so towards the 6th century, this has happened, 4th to 6th, that happened, and then the kind of the 4th, you can say, stage of development was between the 6th and the 7th century, where the movements then developed. So the books of laws developed, and the movements kind of developed. And again, I don't want to go into the history of each of the mazahib, what were the books which were written, what were the details. Again, you can kind of, all that information is available. You can read it again amongst various sources which are there. Inshallah, you can read, if you want to read the history of Imam, the Hanafi mazhab, you can read. If you want to know more about the Maliki mazhab, you can, that all that information is available, inshallah, amongst the biographies of these great imams. And also there are a lot of lectures which have been given. You can find them on YouTube and have a look, inshallah. A lot of, mashallah, speakers have given a lot of detailed lectures on understanding of how the mazhab of the great imams actually evolved and developed. So, in my, obviously, the session today, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the summarization aspects of these mazahib. Now, so these books of law, they developed. So you had the Ashari, the Maturidi, the Ahlul Hadith, all these kind of, you can say, methodologies, they started to form in a large extent, in a kind of a codified way. Although you can say that Ahlul Hadith, obviously, methodology was never kind of, it always existed, yeah, it was always there, but there was no formal codification, because it was mainly through the understanding of the hadith and the fiqh of Imam Bukhari and the fiqh of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. You can say the Athari creed was represented mainly by Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. You can say to a large extent, and also you can say that obviously the proponents of the Athari creed obviously were Imam Shafi as well as Imam Malik to a large extent as well. Imam Abu Hanifa was more on the other side of the spectrum. Now, then the Ghazali, as I've mentioned, Ghazali and Imam Al-Razi, they brought in with the Ashari taught, and they were the proponents. And again, Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he wrote that famous book, as we all know, in I think 10 volumes. He replied to Imam Ghazali when he wrote that book. And again, all this is happening within the 7th century, which is where when Ibn Taymiyyah actually passed away. And then his students, obviously, Imam Ibn al-Qayyim and etc., they came in and they continued to propose the way of how Imam Ibn Taymiyyah understood. Now, the rigidity started to take place where no new thought was coming in. But what was happening is that these great books which were being written, the summarized versions of those books continued to be written between the 8th and the 12th century. So you can say that is the kind of the rigid era where nothing much has taken place. Everything was in existence. Whatever thought was in existence, it continued. No original thought was coming in. And this is the 4 decades, you can say in a nutshell, this is how they were. Then you reach the final stage, which is, you can say, the modernity, which is from the 13th century till the present time. You can say roughly 200 and something odd years now, which we are now living. Now, what was happening within this time, as we have seen in the last kind of 200 years, 250 years or so, what is taking place? So all these various philosophies now, the new philosophies after the Renaissance, etc., they were superimposing themselves onto Islam. The European thought is clashing into Islam. So you have the people like Napoleon, which is now conquering Egypt. He is invading Egypt. On the other hand, you have the British Raj, which is conquering the subcontinent. Yeah, and what is happening is the Khilafah Osmaniya, it is being dismantled. Yeah, and then you have this Western army, the guns which are coming in, and you have the Mamluks on one end, and you have the Ottomans on the other hand, and you have the Mughals on the third end. And all that is now, what is happening? All that is going down. And as that is going down, because of the rigidity which has taken place, unfortunately, something which transpired amongst the Muslims was that as through the European Renaissance, the Europeans started to retranslate the works of the philosophers, amongst the Andalusian scholars, back into their languages. Muslims gave a fatwa that we should not be using the printing press. So for 350 years, there was no printing press amongst any of the lands of the Muslims. So whatever books were being copied, they were copied in the old style, and a very kind of, you can imagine, in a very lazy kind of a way. And obviously there was no flourishing. Nothing flourishing was happening. Absolute rigidity, not moving with the pace of time, having these very old philosophies and old schools. This is what was going on. Now, when this was happening, and there was this Egyptian invasion by Napoleon, and as I've mentioned, the other kind of parts of the world. So there was a catalyst now for the Muslims. So the catalyst was that what should be happening, when Napoleon brought in the printing press to Egypt, I think around about 1798 or 1799, something along those lines, he brought in the first printing press to Egypt. Yeah, and now the catalyst was they need to do something. The Muslims, they wanted to do something. So, for example, you had the movements like the 1857 War of Independence, yeah, and then you have this Deobandi school, yeah, which actually formed out of that movement. So on one hand, you had amongst the Najd, you have amongst the Arabian Peninsula, you had the likes of Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, who was kind of coming in within the Puritan strand of Islam, yeah, and you had other movements in other parts of the world, like the Deobandi movement in India, which actually were being formed. And the Mughal era was coming to an end; it was being abolished. And the last of the Mughals, they were thrown out into Nepal, and they died a miserable death, obviously, over there. Now, the Queen of England, obviously, now is ruling over a vast empire. Yeah, that is happening. And now within these various movements, now there is a struggle. Now, what is the struggle? The struggle is that how do we retain the lost glory of Islam? Right now, even we have this philosophy amongst obviously a lot of zealot Muslims and the young guns, and that how do we, and alhamdulillah, this is a very good thing. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Alhamdulillah, this is an excellent thing, because that means that the Muslim mind and the Muslim heart is still alive. Yeah, that how do we bring back the lost glory? Yeah, but that is a different subject. I'm not going to go into that. But when Muslims started thinking about that, so you had within within these kind of the Deobandi movement, then you had other movements. You had the Hayatis and you had the Mamatis. So you had the Tabligis, which came about from as an offshoot of the Deobandi movement. That they said, we need to go out and we need to do the tazkir of the people and bring them back to Islam. This is their philosophy. This is how they were kind of coming in. How do we better ourselves? A lot of emphasis was being paid on improving the family, improving the community, having this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to counter, you can say the Deobandi movement, the Sufis, they brought in the Brelviya movement within Indian subcontinent. Yeah. So this was happening in the subcontinent area. On the other trend in Egypt, in Misr, so you had the Ikhwanis, you had Rashid Rida, and you had prior to Rashid Rida, Muhammad Abduhu with their philosophies, where they were saying that in order to answer the European modernity, there needs to be something, the Islamic thought needs to be revitalized. Islamic thought needs to be kind of, we have to re-look as to how do we understand certain things, how do we understand certain text. So on one hand, you had the Deobandis, who were the isolationists, who were saying, no, we shouldn't be changing the language at all. Anything to do with the cultural change, they said, no way, we're not going to change from the culture. Dress code, they said, no, we are not even going to be changing the dress code. So as a counter reaction, to this particular philosophy, obviously we know that we have the likes of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, which then put in this great university, Aligarh University, and his philosophy was on the other spectrum, that we have to follow the British in everything. And he obviously then, as we know, that he made a lot of mistakes as to, he did immense amount of tawilat with regards to how to understand the certain verses of the Quran, etc., etc. And again, I'm not going to go into that. But I'm just stating that a lot of what was happening in the last 200, 250 years, a lot of it is boiling down to how the Muslim thought has actually progressed over time. Now, so this twist is happening in Egypt. On the other hand, you also have Iran. So what is happening to the Shia, the Shia kind of the philosophy now? So you have the Baha'is amongst the Shias, you have the Ismailis, and then later on, what you're having is that you're having Khomeini, Imam Khomeini, which is the political side of Shiism, the political side of the Shiites. Again, it started with a quieter kind of a movement, and obviously, as we all know, then there was a revolution in Iran, and then so Khomeini basically said that we are not going to be waiting for the 12th Imam to come out. We have to change the course of Shiism. So, and he brought in this concept of Wilayatul Faqih, and that's basically that before Mahdi comes, we need to do something. We need to prepare the minds and we need to prepare the groundwork. This is what his philosophy was. On the other hand, amongst the Sunnis now, you have as I mentioned, the Ikhwani, Abdur, the Rashid Rada stand, and they had this concept of the Muslim Renaissance, and they also there was a little bit of the concept of defeatism, within their psyche, there was a concept of defeatism from an angle that people are being impressed by others, so they are saying to the even today we have this. Whenever we want to reply to, let's say, a non-believer, we say that look back into the Spanish era of the Muslim empire, the Andalusian era of the Muslims. Yeah, so we always want to refer back to our lost glory. Yeah, so again, this is defeatism. No, we don't say that. Whatever happened, alhamdulillah, has happened in the past. Now we have to move forward. We have to look ahead of us exactly what is going to be taking place. So, and this famous quote, which we all know, which I think even nowadays a lot of people say, which, if I remember correctly, I think Rashid Rida said it, that when he went to France, he said that in France I saw Islam but no Muslims, and when I came back to the Muslim lands, then I saw Muslims but no Islam. This famous quote which he had. So Rashid Rida died in 1935, and the concept of this new Salafism, the new Salafi movement, then came about from Abduhu, which he brought about because he was saying that Al Azhar University, it is being it's being very rigid. The ossification of Azhar has happened, and he's saying that he wants a revival now. Yeah, so you can say that the first 300 years, if you remember, the first 300 years from the first century to the fourth century. So Abduhu now is calling to go back to those particular early days to to have the correct kind of the creed implemented, the puritanical creed implemented, but doing what? By meshing it with the modern concepts of the Europeans. This is what he tried to do. And he tried to kind of go back and reinvent the thought process. So he said, we are going to be refreshing the thought process. Yeah. And then obviously from there, you have again the Abduhu Salafism against the modern Salafism, which is there. Now, amongst the latter strands, as we have seen now, in the last, you can say, it's like 20 years, yeah, 2 decades or so, even you can say it's slightly more than that. You have another strand of Muslims now, which we can say they call themselves progressive Muslims. So these progressive Muslims now, they have gone into extremes now on the other spectrum, where they are justifying same-sex marriages, etc., and they are coming up with these weird philosophy, obviously, which have nothing to do with Islam at all. Now, within that, you had people like Jamaluddin Akhwani, who was the protege of Abduhu. In 1897, he passed away. And you had these different kind of books which are being written, the Majallat which are being written by Abduhu, the Majallatul Manar which he published, the tajdeed of the Muslim thinking, the tajdeed of the Muslim mind is what he was trying to have. And again, this term was readopted, you can say, in our times, obviously, and Sheikh Albani was obviously the proponent of this term Salafism in its new context, yeah. And again, he propagated it, mashallah. Our era, as my age, I'm in my mid-40s, so a lot of the people we see, my friends and my, my colleagues, and a lot of, obviously, we are just speakers, very low-level speakers, but scholars, as we have seen from our era, mashallah, which then went on to universities, graduated. For example, Sheikh Albani, he was 3 years as the head of the faculty of Hadeeth in Medina. So, Sheikh bin Baz was there, Sheikh obviously Salih bin Uthaymeen was there. And you had these great scholars which then brought in this new kind of philosophy, which again, we can argue that it gave this real impetus to the Salafist stand of Islam. And mashallah, may Allah reward all of them abundantly, and inshallah increase light upon their graves, inshallah. And mashallah, they did so much for the cause of Islam. So this particular movement, you can say, was the latest movement. You can say that 90 to 95% of the Muslims attribute themselves now, who are amongst the Salafi strand, to this particular movement in the West or anywhere in the subcontinent or other places. So, for example, Shah Waliullah obviously had a massive role to play within the subcontinent. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad had a tremendous role to play. You had the likes of Maududi, and you had the likes of other kind of in the subcontinent who had a lot of a role to play, within the particular concept of these different lands. But again, the main thrust has always been of kind of these new trends has been that how do we understand fiqh through hadith? Yeah, this has been the new trend. After, you can say, the rigidity of the schools, mashallah, if we understand, yani again, the true philosophy of the giants, the true philosophy of the imams, then their philosophy was that obviously, they were alike. Their akida was alike. Their understanding from an akida perspective was, the three creed again. But again, yani their love and affection amongst the great imams was immense. So the respect of Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa was immense. And the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, they became the students of Imam Malik. And Imam Shafi, he was a student of Imam Malik, and also he was a student of yani Imam Layth bin Saad in Egypt, and he studied under them. And then again, Imam Bukhari was a student of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. So again, these great muhaddiseen which came in after the, you can say, the first 150 years, after kind of towards the end of yani the second century, is where the great muhaddiseen came in. So this is, I think, inshallah, we'll kind of give it a stop here, because again, there's a lot of discussion around what has happened beyond that, yeah, and how do we now make sense of this particular hadith. So now, inshallah, what we've covered today is a little bit of the historical background, and obviously in a very fast-paced way, a summarized kind of a narrative. So we'll continue to develop on this narrative, and then we'll try to, inshallah, understand this particular hadith of the 73 sects from this particular angle. So the whole point is, the whole objective is to give you a flavor as to how the author, when he's bringing these particular ahadiths, then there is a reason he is bringing these particular hadiths. There's a reason in chapter 1 and 2 is mentioning this, because the shayateen, they have done something amongst the large majority of the Muslim minds, as they have disunited, the shayateen have disunited the Muslims at large by actually picking on minor differences, fiqhi differences, which was never the objective of the major scholars. So jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, see you next week. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.